In a chamber on Titan that the broader Imperium doesn't know exists, there is a wooden box. Not an ornate reliquary encrusted with purity seals and aquilas. Not a vault sealed with cogitator locks, engraved with 8,000 years of heraldry, reinforced by 5 centuries of Mechanicus blessing rites. A plain wooden box holding a piece of parchment, kept inside the Chamber of Purity in the Grey Knights fortress-monastery on Saturn's largest moon. The only person in the entire Imperium authorized to open it's the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. Not the High Lords of Terra, whose political mandate spans 100,000 worlds. Not the Adeptus Custodes, who maintain a garrison of 10,000 warriors inside the Imperial Palace, where the Emperor's body currently sits. Not the Inquisition, the organization explicitly chartered with containing humanity's most dangerous knowledge. One warrior, per generation, 10,000 years. The box contains the Terminus Decree. This has been Warhammer 40,000 canon since 2011, when the 5th edition Grey Knights Codex introduced the Decree as a sealed mystery, ancient, significant, entrusted to one specific rank for reasons the Codex chose not to explain. The 7th edition Codex repeated it without resolving it. The Horus Heresy novel series, a publishing project spanning 30-plus volumes and over a decade of releases, circled the decree without ever opening it. The r/40k lore subreddit had documented theoretical arguments about the decree's contents by at least 2017, with community members already proposing the Prevent Emperor's Rebirth reading as a serious theoretical position 8 years before the canonical reveal confirmed it as the actual answer. Bolter and Chainsword maintained dedicated pre-reveal speculation threads reaching into Golden Throne collapse scenarios. Lewitton09, Chapter Master Valrak, Major Kill, and the broader YouTube lore community had built audiences in part around the decree's status as one of the setting's most deliberately sealed questions. 14 real-world years of sealed mystery, 10,000 years of in-universe silence. In July 2025, the 10th edition Grey Knights Codex was published. Valrak, Lewitton09, and Major Kill were covering its contents within days of the book's release. The reveal wasn't a dedicated Warhammer community article with accompanying artwork and the appropriate weight of ceremony. Not a preview event. Not a standalone lore drop calibrated to signal that something significant was about to land. Games Workshop put the Terminus Decree's contents in a sidebar, the supplementary margin text, the contextual boxes that run alongside stat blocks and equipment tables in rulebooks. The secondary typography that a reader skimming for mechanical content could scroll past without noticing. Here is what the sidebar says. The Master of Mankind can never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, either return to life, reborn in another's body, or ascend as some kind of warp entity. The Grey Knights must return him to his terrible duty. That's the decree. 14 years, a wooden box, a sidebar. The Codex also confirms the decree offers no guidance on how any of these feats might be achieved. It's neither a weapon nor a magic formula, just an absolute prohibition across 3 specific scenarios, the word return doing the entire operational lifting, and no attached method for how a chapter of roughly 1,000 Space Marines is supposed to reverse the departure of a returned living god. The community description that spread fastest through forums and comment sections after the reveal was Post-it note. That framing is almost generous. Post-it notes are written quickly, by someone with limited time, for tasks too transient to warrant a full document. The Emperor had time to enumerate 3 distinct failure conditions. He chose a wooden box as the delivery mechanism and arranged for the knowledge to transfer exclusively through one person per generation for 100 centuries. That's architecturally more deliberate than a post-it note. It just isn't more informative. The frustration this generated is intellectually legitimate, and it deserves a fair hearing before this script goes anywhere near the more interesting question the reveal actually opens. The argument for disappointment isn't emotional, it's structural. For a secret to justify the classification level the Terminus Decree uses, The information inside needs to be functionally unavailable through any other channel. The architecture of the secrecy is itself a signal. 14 years of sealed mystery, accessible only to one rank within one chapter. That setup implies the knowledge is destabilizing, operationally sensitive, or dangerous enough that even the people positioned closest to the relevant situation can't be trusted with it. The Adeptus Custodes guarding the Emperor's body have no access. The Adeptus Mechanicus priests who maintain the Golden Throne have no access. The High Lords governing in the Emperor's name have no access. The rest of the Grey Knights chapter, whose entire institutional purpose is fighting chaos and demons in the Emperor's name, don't know the box exists. One person per generation inherits the knowledge, and the infrastructure around that inheritance implies the knowledge is the kind that could collapse institutions if it spread. Now examine what the knowledge is. Keep the Emperor on the throne. The Adeptus Custodes have spent 10,000 years doing exactly that. Their mandate since the Horus Heresy has been to protect the Emperor's body and execute his will. Protecting his body means ensuring nothing removes him from the machine sustaining his partial life. So the Custodes' baseline operational posture already enforces the decree without knowing it exists. The Adeptus Mechanicus, whose entire institutional existence is predicated on the Emperor's continued presence, has every structural incentive to maintain the throne indefinitely. The Astronomicon runs on his psychic output, and if it fails, the Imperium's million worlds lose the navigational beacon that keeps them connected. The High Lords govern a political structure built on the Emperor's nominal authority. If he leaves the throne under any of the three prohibited scenarios, their power structure collapses simultaneously with every other structure. Every major institution in the Imperium is already aligned, by overwhelming self-interest if nothing else, to prevent the Emperor's departure. So what scenario requires a separate, sealed, supremely compartmentalized instruction, accessible to one warrior per generation, unknown to every institution that already maintains the status quo, to maintain a status quo that everyone else is already maintaining as their primary function? That's the structural question underneath the community's frustration. Responses across forums and comment threads, "They ruined it," the argument that GW damaged the decree, for their own product's detriment, are landing on a real target. The gap between the secrecy mechanism and the instruction's apparent redundancy is genuine. If GW's answer is simply, yes, everyone is already doing this, and also the Grey Knights have a note saying to do it too, then the secrecy apparatus around that note doesn't make internal logical sense. Secrets of this classification level exist for scenarios where the standard apparatus fails. The decree implies a situation where every other institution gets the call wrong, where the Custodes follow a returned emperor rather than opposing him, where the High Lords recognize a reborn emperor and bow to his authority, where every structural incentive currently maintaining the status quo points in the opposite direction. A scenario where keep the emperor on the throne is already obvious to every institution that matters wouldn't require a sealed failsafe held by one warrior with no direct institutional connection to the throne's maintenance. The instruction is obvious. The secrecy around it isn't. Both facts are canonical. The gap between them is where the actual story lives. Before going there, the community's 14-year theoretical scorecard deserves a proper run. R/40K lore had documented interpretive arguments about the decree by at least 2017. By 2023, the publication of Dan Abnett's The End and the Death had split the discourse between competing readings. Three major positions dominated the pre-reveal landscape, running them now against the canonical answer. The resurrection reading was the plurality position in community discourse before the reveal, and its lore grounding was genuine. The Emperor's current state on the Golden Throne, neither fully alive nor fully dead, sustained by 1,000 psychers sacrificed daily, psychically active in ways the lore deliberately leaves ambiguous, reads narratively as a problem staged for resolution. The 40K timeline across 8th and 9th editions had been arranging what looked like escalatory change. Primarchs returning to service, Robute Guilliman already governing from Terra as Lord Commander of the Imperium, the Great Rift splitting the galaxy in two and pushing the setting toward crisis thresholds demanding a proportionate response. The resurrection theory read the decree as the mechanism of that response. A sealed instruction containing the specific conditions under which the Emperor's current state could be safely concluded and his restoration initiated. The secrecy made perfect structural sense under this framing. A returned Emperor would require exact coordination to prevent the announcement from collapsing the Imperium faster than his absence would. The High Lords, whose power derives from governing in the Emperor's absence, would need to be managed before they could interfere. The Adeptus Mechanicus would need the technical sequence to conclude the throne's function in a controlled manner. The Custodes would need precise positioning instructions for the transition. The Supreme Grand Master on this reading was the executor of a precisely timed event, holding the operational script for the Imperium's actual survival scenario, not its maintenance scenario. A variant drew on the Emperor's canonical nature as a perpetual, the class of human who reincarnates rather than permanently dying. On this reading, the decree didn't describe restoring the current body at all. It described verification protocols for a new incarnation, criteria the Supreme Grand Master could use to confirm a psychically gifted child born somewhere in the Imperium was genuinely the Emperor's next form rather than a chaos imitation. The Star Child theory, one of 40K's oldest and most persistently argued lore frameworks, fed directly into this variant and carried decades of semi-canonical support behind it. The 2025 Codex inverts both readings completely. The decree prohibits the Emperor's return to life, explicitly prohibits his reincarnation in another's body. The Supreme Grand Master who opens the wooden box learns not how to bring the Emperor back through any mechanism, but how to ensure whatever form the Emperor attempts to return in gets reversed. The theory correctly identified the decree's subject, the Emperor's potential departure from his current state, and correctly identified the decree as mechanically connected to that subject. It read the instruction as a door-opening mechanism when it was a deadbolt. Right territory, inverted conclusion. Half credit for subject identification, 0 for the answer. The Warp God Ascension reading is more interesting to grade in 2025 than it was to generate before the reveal, because the canonical text makes it partially correct rather than simply wrong. The theory held that the decree authorized the Emperor's transformation into a new warp entity, something operating at the structural scale of the Chaos powers, but aligned in the opposite direction. The four ruinous powers draw sustenance from fundamental aspects of mortal consciousness. Khorne from violence and slaughter, Nurgle from despair and decay, Tzeentch from ambition and manipulation, Slaanesh from sensation pushed past endurance. These entities can't be destroyed because the emotional spectrum sustaining them can't be destroyed. The only mechanism operating at the same cosmological scale would be a fifth warp power built from 10,000 years of human devotion and the Emperor's accumulated psychic mass, operating as a structural counterforce rather than another avenue of corruption. The decree on this reading was the activation document. The Imperium's religious cult around the Emperor was the fuel being gathered. The appeal went beyond narrative satisfaction. The Ascension reading gave the Imperium an actual exit from a stated terminal decline, and the solution matched the problem's stated scale. A warp entity built from human faith, opposing entities built from human weakness, is the one class of solution that operates at the same altitude as the threat. The 2025 Codex prohibits the Emperor from ascending as some kind of warp entity, that exact scenario. But the prohibition connects to something canonical in the Horus Heresy Siege of Terra series that transforms the theory from simply wrong to wrong by exactly 180 degrees. The Emperor's potential warp entity form isn't a fan invention. The Siege of Terra series names it the Dark King. During the Siege of Terra itself, under the accumulated psychic pressure of the worst war in human history with demonic forces already breaching Terra's surface, The emperor was in the process of this transformation. The conditions were present. The process had initiated. In the end and the death, Alanius Person's intervention, a mortal human dying in front of the emperor at the exact critical threshold, broke the process. The emperor chose, in that specific moment, not to become the Dark King. The Terminus Decree extends that single choice across every future moment the choice might need to be made again. For every future scenario where a returned emperor or a reborn emperor or an ascending emperor faces the same threshold, the psychic pressure, the accumulated weight, the specific conditions that almost produced the Dark King once before, the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights carries the instruction to pull him back. The Warp God Ascension theory correctly identified that the Emperor's warp entity potential is real, canonical, and that the decree connects to it. It was wrong only in assuming the decree authorized the transformation rather than prohibiting it. The theorists found the exact right door and assumed it opened inward. Closest to the canonical answer, correct scenario, correct stakes, correct identification of the connection between the decree and the Dark King threshold. Missed the direction of the instruction by 180 degrees. This is the one theory whose underlying premise the 2025 Codex actively confirms. The kill switch reading gained traction partly because 40K's established tone makes Scorched Earth solutions feel appropriate, and partly because it had a specific textual anchor that moved it past pure speculation. The theory held that the decree was a pre-authorized weapon against the Primarch's gene lines, against the Space Marines as an institution, or against Imperial civilization in a broader Scorched Earth scenario. The reasoning was coherent. The Horus Heresy had already demonstrated that the Emperor's greatest creations were capable of consuming the civilization they were built to protect. An intelligence operating with the Emperor's demonstrated foresight might have pre-authorized the removal of his most powerful tools for the version of the future where they became the obstacle rather than the instrument. The theory spread further than pure speculation would reach because the end and the death provided apparent textual support. Abnett's novel contains a genetic weapon targeting transhumans, an Emperor-sanctioned, Malcador-planned protocol capable of destroying all Space Marine gene templates. Reddit threads from 2023, after the novel's publication, argued in detail that this weapon was the Terminus Decree. A viewer who entered that community discourse claiming the end and the death revealed the decree as an order to kill all Astartes was engaging with actual published novel content, not inventing a theory from nothing. The argument sustained serious simultaneous debate on bolter and chainsword and r/40K lore. The 2025 Codex draws a firm distinction. The weapon in The End and the Death and the Terminus Decree in the wooden box on Titan are separate pieces of lore. The genetic weapon exists. The decree's contents are the 5 lines in the Codex sidebar. A Warhammer 40,000 fandom forum thread, published before the 2025 Codex was even available, had already identified this distinction explicitly, noting the transhuman weapon was not necessarily the Terminus Decree that the Grey Knights were left with. Games Workshop allowed both pieces of lore to coexist in community discourse without editorially distinguishing them for approximately 2 years after the novel's publication. The ambiguity sustaining the theory was, in significant part, an artifact of GW's own publishing architecture. Wrong canonical conclusion. The theory correctly identified a real weapon in published novel lore and misidentified its relationship to the decree the Codex confirms. The internal logic was sound. The methodology was defensible. The conclusion was wrong. The combined scorecard produces one finding worth sitting with. Every major theory correctly identified the decree's subject, the Emperor's relationship to his own possible futures, specifically the question of departure from his current state. Every theory assumed the decree pointed toward something, when the Codex text reveals it pointed away from 3 specific things. The community found the right territory for 14 years and couldn't quite get the direction right. Nobody in the mainstream theoretical landscape guessed the Emperor's final recorded instruction was to sit still. That makes the answer not just disappointing, but specifically strange. The Emperor is a perpetual. He has always known he doesn't permanently die. His operational decisions throughout the Great Crusade demonstrate foresight on a generational scale. He chose the Golden Throne voluntarily, understanding precisely what the choice cost him. After 10,000 years of ongoing semi-death on a failing machine, his sealed instruction for the only scenario where any of that finally changes is 5 lines saying, "Don't let him." Why those 5 lines and not a method? The enforcement problem is where to start, because it reveals something the decree's text buries entirely. The scenario activates. The Emperor begins to return in one of the 3 prohibited forms. The Supreme Grand Master reads the box, convenes the chapter, and travels to Terra to stop him. The Adeptus Custodes are on Terra, all 10,000 of them, with their entire institutional mandate pointed at protecting the Emperor and executing his will. A returned Emperor, in a new body, a restored biological form, or as an ascending warp entity, would project the psychic and physical authority the Custodes have spent 10,000 years training to recognize and obey. The institutional reflex built across 10 millennia of loyalty doesn't have an external override. Following the returned Emperor is what the Custodes do. They aren't built to evaluate whether doing so is correct. They're built to do it. The Grey Knights, attempting to enforce the decree, would be fighting the Emperor's own Praetorian Guard on Terra, without allies, because no institution outside the Supreme Grand Master knows the decree exists. They would arrive with approximately 1 chapter-strength force, roughly 1,000 Space Marines, against 10,000 custodians individually described as superior in combat to virtually any other warrior class in the Imperium. Operating near the Golden Throne, in proximity to the Sisters of Silence who maintain a permanent presence on Terra, the Grey Knights' psychic capabilities, the primary attribute that makes them exceptional, would be significantly degraded on exactly the ground where they needed them most. This is what the Emperor designed. The obvious interpretation is that GW didn't follow the structural implications through, and the enforcement problem is an oversight. The other interpretation is that the enforcement was never designed to work, and the Emperor knew it. Consider what the enforcement scenario produces even when the Grey Knights lose. A returned Emperor opposed at the threshold by his own most compartmentalized failsafe is an Emperor who encounters resistance he didn't publicly build. The Grey Knights' arrival, even if they're defeated in hours, creates a delay. In a setting where individual minutes at the Siege of Terra change the outcome of a galactic war, a delay of any duration creates conditions for additional response. More relevantly, the Grey Knights' opposition creates a moment of accounting. An Emperor who arrives at his return and finds the specific force he charged with his most secret instruction is the force opposing that return has to stop and process the fact of that opposition. That moment of processing, even if it concludes in the chapter's destruction, is a moment of potential reconsideration built into the architecture of the scene. The decree doesn't claim the Grey Knights will succeed. The operative word is must. They must try. Not will succeed, not are guaranteed to prevent. Must as obligation. The Emperor designed a force to attempt the instruction, not a force to guarantee its outcome. The question of why the Grey Knights specifically, rather than any other institution, reveals what the decree is actually testing for. The Custodes' mandate is to protect the Emperor and execute his will. Their threat recognition framework is built around identifying things that threaten him, not evaluating whether the entity presenting itself as the Emperor is genuinely the Emperor. A chaos imitation precise enough and powerful enough to project his psychic signature convincingly would defeat the Custodes' evaluation framework at the most fundamental level, because that framework was never designed to apply skepticism toward the Emperor himself. They aren't built to point weapons at something presenting itself as their master. The Grey Knights are. Their entire operational history across 10,000 years is built on the premise that warp-active entities of enormous power lie, that authority projections from the warp require verification rather than automatic deference, and that the correct response to a psychically overwhelming entity claiming divine authority is a specific kind of skeptical evaluation that psychic training enables and institutionalizes. Every Grey Knight carries capabilities oriented specifically toward identifying chaos-adjacent entities that have assumed false identities or projected false authority. Those are exactly the capabilities needed to evaluate a returned emperor, to determine whether the entity presenting itself as the master of mankind is genuinely him, a chaos imitation wearing his face, or something worse, a genuine emperor in the process of becoming the Dark King. The Inquisition has a broader mandate, less direct authority near the throne, and an institutional culture of internal division that makes monolithic action on a single unprecedented target essentially impossible. The High Lords are political actors. The Mechanicus are engineers. The Custodes are protectors whose psychology is oriented around recognizing a specific thing as theirs to protect. The Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights is the only role in the Imperium combining the authority to evaluate a warp-active entity claiming to be the Emperor, a chapter-sized force capable of acting on that evaluation, the psychic resistance to maintain the evaluation under that entity's active influence, and absolute secrecy from every institution that might otherwise interfere. This isn't a general-purpose failsafe. It's a job description calibrated for the exact moment when every other institution would reach the wrong conclusion. The Golden Throne isn't a stable equilibrium, and that distinction matters enormously for the decree's actual operational context. The throne was designed using recovered Dark Age of technology relics, specifically based on an Akashic reader, a device that amplifies a central psyker's warp connection through multiple supporting psykers. The Emperor on the throne isn't dormant or in stasis. He is connected to the warp through an amplifier, continuously, for 10,000 years, while the entities on the other side of that connection have had 10 millennia to work on whatever the connection enables. The Siege of Terra produced the conditions for the Dark King almost once. What generated those conditions was the accumulated psychic weight of the war, the demonic incursion active on Terra's surface, and the specific pressure of watching his creations destroy his life's work. All three of those conditions are still present, in some form, on the throne. The psychic pressure of 10,000 years of semi-death, the continuous warp exposure through an amplifier device, the demonic forces that have never stopped probing the connection from the other side. Sources from the expanded universe establish that the throne is failing. The Adeptus Mechanicus can't repair it. The machine is degrading, and as it degrades, the life support efficiency decreases. The psychic pressure on the Emperor's consciousness increases, and the conditions the decree was designed to catch grow closer to the threshold that almost triggered once during the siege. The decree orders the Grey Knights to keep the Emperor on the throne. The throne is failing. The decree offers no method, no formula, no contingency for what happens when the machine simply stops. The instruction was written with the implicit assumption that either the machine would hold indefinitely or the prohibition would be triggered by one of the three specified departure scenarios before the throne's failure timeline ran out. The throne's failure timeline is moving. The decree doesn't address the scenario where the machine fails around the Emperor while he remains technically in place. That is the most operationally relevant scenario the Supreme Grand Master currently faces, and it has no guidance. The three specific prohibitions are individually strange in ways that become more interesting the longer you look at them. Return to life in the existing body is the biological recovery scenario, the throne's life support function concluding successfully enough that the Emperor regains active biological function. The current Imperial medical and technological infrastructure can't accomplish this. The prohibition's existence implies the scenario is possible under circumstances that don't currently exist. Prohibiting an impossible outcome requires either that the author knew the scenario would eventually become possible, or that the author was writing preventive architecture for a future state he had already observed. Rebirth in another's body is the perpetual mechanism. Perpetuals reincarnate rather than permanently dying. A perpetual at the Emperor's psychic magnitude dying from throne failure would produce a new incarnation elsewhere in the galaxy, carrying 10,000 years of accumulated psychic mass into a new biological form growing from infancy. The resulting entity would have the Emperor's full capability with no institutional anchor, no verified identity, no political structure built around recognizing and protecting him, and no connection to the Custodes, whose mandate is to protect a body currently on a specific throne on Terra. The decree's prohibition against this exit vector is the Emperor sealing off his own survival mechanism. The one exit from his current state that would guarantee his consciousness continues past his current body's failure is the exit he specifically prohibited. The reason to seal that exit is disturbing to consider. An Emperor reincarnating freely would enter the galaxy in a form the Imperium has no mechanism to track, identify, or protect. A child somewhere on an agro-world, coming into power gradually, without the institutional scaffolding that currently constrains what the Emperor can and can't do. The Chaos Powers, which have spent 10,000 years probing the Emperor's warp connection from the other side of the throne's amplifier, would have had 10,000 years to prepare for exactly the reincarnation scenario. They know his soul's signature. They know how perpetuals work. A reincarnating Emperor is an unprotected Emperor, and unprotected is something the Emperor may have calculated he can't afford to be at the specific moment when the throne fails. Ascension as a warp entity is the Dark King scenario, already addressed. The prohibition names this exact form, which means the Emperor considered it live enough to specify by name rather than leaving it under a general prohibition. The conditions for the Dark King's emergence were real in 30,000. The throne's ongoing amplification of the Emperor's warp connection means those conditions aren't static. The prohibition isn't preventive in the abstract. It addresses a process the Emperor already knows can initiate. 3 exits sealed. The only remaining option is staying on a failing machine with no solution provided. The single most specific word in the decree's text is return. The instruction doesn't say prevent, doesn't say destroy, doesn't say deny or eliminate or oppose with lethal force. The Grey Knights must return the Emperor to his terrible duty. Return implies the entity in question still exists in a form that can be engaged, still carries an identity that can receive an instruction and respond to it. The Grey Knights aren't being sent to eliminate a threat. They're being sent to redirect one. Returning an Emperor successfully reborn in a new body means locating that body, engaging the entity inside it, and persuading or forcing the galaxy's most powerful psyker to abandon the free, unanchored existence his reincarnation produced and return to the machine failing on Terra. Returning an ascending Dark King means engaging a nascent 5th warp power at the moment of its formation and reversing a cosmological process that the end and the death established was only broken once before by a specific mortal dying in front of the Emperor at the exact right threshold moment. A single point of failure mechanism that can't be reliably replicated because it required Alania's person specifically at that specific moment, and Alania's person isn't available for a second attempt. The instruction is so operationally impossible across all 3 scenarios that either the Emperor had a specific method and chose not to include it in the text, or he wrote the only instruction he had available, regardless of whether it was achievable, and trusted the person reading it to figure out the rest. Both interpretations leave the Supreme Grand Master in the same position: a wooden box, 5 lines, and the word must. What the Emperor chose not to write down is the most interesting part of the document that isn't there. The decree contains no method, no weapon, no formula, no guidance on how any of the 3 scenarios might be identified early, intercepted before they reach the enforcement threshold, or actually reversed once initiated. The Codex confirms this explicitly. The decree offers no guidance on how such feats may be achieved. It's the prohibition without the instrument. 3 possible explanations for the absence. The first: the Emperor's consciousness, by the time the throne took hold, was no longer capable of that level of operational planning. The decree is what he could produce under those conditions. the absolute core of what mattered, stripped of everything that required a functioning strategic mind to elaborate. If this is true, the Terminus Decree is the most important thing the Emperor said before he lost the capacity to say anything further, and it matters precisely because it's incomplete. The second, the operational content is too dangerous to commit to parchment in a wooden box. A method for reversing the Emperor's ascension as a warp entity is also a method usable in the inverse direction, to accelerate the ascension rather than reverse it. A reversal mechanism for the perpetual reincarnation is also a mechanism for intercepting and corrupting that reincarnation. The decree's operational emptiness may be deliberate security architecture. The authorization to act is sealed separately from the method, which is sealed somewhere else, accessible to someone who doesn't know the decree exists any more than the decree's keeper knows about the method. The third, the Emperor had already seen this specific moment. The warp isn't bound by linear time in the way biological consciousness is, and 10,000 years of continuous warp exposure through the throne's amplifier isn't equivalent to ordinary perception. If the Emperor's consciousness, distributed across the warp's probability space through the amplifier he built and has been sitting on since the siege, had already experienced the moment the decree gets opened and used, had already seen how the attempt resolves, then the absence of operational content isn't an oversight. It's the Emperor confirming that the required action can't be written down because it will be obvious to the person who needs to take it at the moment they need to take it, in a way that no prior description could adequately capture. None of these explanations close the question. All three are internally coherent with canonical lore. The 10th edition Codex sidebar doesn't tell us which is true, and that omission, an omission within an omission, a missing method inside a minimal decree, is either the most deliberate narrative architecture GW has built in years, or the most productive oversight they've ever committed. The throne is failing. The decree prohibits the Emperor's 3 available exits. The fourth scenario, dying while staying,